This is Top of Mind, the Dr. Patrick Slowinski Show.
Hello, Dr. Slowinski, and welcome back, everyone, to Top of Mind podcast. Today, we're diving once again into one of our favorite arenas and with a really seasoned insider here. So stay tuned for straight from the corridors inside. You won't get anywhere else. Dr. Slowinski, to you.
Thank you, Victor. So we've had several months now since January, President Trump's second term. And I think what we're finding in that term is that he has tried to think outside the box in every aspect, domestic and international. And of course, our country's very bifurcated. It is divided. And to deny that political ideologies are influencing people's opinions about the president would be, just silly. But people do it. And some of the people who are doing it still are some of my friends and colleagues, former colleagues. Lately, there was a letter that came out, a letter of concern from retired diplomats and national security officials. About 200 people signed this letter. And I really struggled with whether I should do a reaction to this at all, because on the one hand, you don't want to give oxygen to something that doesn't deserve it. I think, like many of these protest letters from has-been or former officials who had great careers, they're no longer in the system, just like I'm a retired diplomat. I'm not in the system. My voice doesn't really matter, nor should I be trying to influence Americans. But this letter comes out and it's called "The Assault on American Democracy, a Call to Action." I wasn't necessarily shocked that several of my former friends and bosses signed this letter, but it's an ad hominem attack in many ways against President Trump and his administration. And I thought to myself, we're going to go through the letter a little bit, just so I can give kind of a flavor. But I thought to myself, I was retired when President Biden was still in office. I would never sign a letter criticizing a sitting president. It just wouldn't. And I think it raises a bigger issue for Americans. And that is, what is the role of our federal employees in general? And then when they retire, really, should they really still be involved so much? And I might surprise people when I tell them, no, I don't really think we should. I think we should move on and do something different. All right, so let's go and highlight the very, the last line there starts with foreign and domestic, and then none of us thought the second part come true. So in the second to the last sentence there,
Okay.
where it says foreign and domestic, all enemies, foreign and domestic. Yeah, let's just do that part there. So my former colleagues and notice, and these are, when they say national security officials, they include the intelligence community. They include any of the agencies that are part of the national security umbrella. What I don't like is that there were 200 of them, but it's almost as if they are speaking for everyone. They're not. They're definitely not speaking for a lot of former diplomats and national security officials who do not agree with how they are characterizing the current situation with President Trump. So that's kind of their play. And here we start with, we swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And then they repeat gratuitously, foreign and domestic. None of us thought the second part of that phrase would ever come into play until now. Wrong, wrong, wrong. It came into play for many of us, half of the country who voted in President Trump during the outrageous Biden administration. So there's huge cognitive dissonance already. It came into play 4 years ago when President Biden was at the helm. So that's not true. But again, it is their projection. They live in a bubble. They do not care what conservatives think. They've labeled us racist, misogynist. You'll see later when they bring out those tropes and those tired phrases about President Trump, which I just find inappropriate. I would never sign a letter like this against President Biden, even though I thought his administration was outrageously atrocious, just like they do. Then we go down to the second paragraph. And then we get to this, but most important was the moral foundation for that power. So let's talk about why they feel comfortable writing about moral foundation. The Democrat Party really believes they have the moral high ground against conservatives. They just believe that. They believe that their social policies in particular give them the moral high ground. And that's why they're able to call people racist, xenophobes, Nazis, white supremacists, and think that it's particularly true. So now they're going to talk about this moral foundation, that they're deciding what the moral foundation is. That America was an example of that. And then, though our actions didn't always live up to our ideals, we stood for simple but powerful ideas that people everywhere embrace: democracy, equality, individual liberty, and human rights. Well, I have no problem with that, and I don't think that that has changed. I think there are several of my colleagues in the IC, the intelligence community, in the national security apparatus that would agree. Those are still values we want to see.
Dr.
They don't see it that
Slowinski,
way. Yeah, go ahead.
would you mind dissecting what do they mean by equality, though, right? Because I believe that these labels don't necessarily mean the same things to us.
No,
as
I
they
think
do to
that's
them.
disingenuous. They've never talked about equality. They've talked about equity. They want equity or special treatment for certain groups. They don't want equality. So I find that disingenuous. I mean, that's what the whole big fight was over DEI and everything, is that the difference between Republicans and conservatives want equality, equal treatment for everyone. Everybody gets the same treatment based on merit. They want equity. So I think that's a disingenuous term there. But if it was truly equality for them, I would have no problem with that. But I don't see that in their policies. I see equity, which means special treatment. It doesn't mean equality. And then we go to the next. The moral foundation is now in grave danger. I actually think that our moral foundation has been revived by putting our country and its citizens first. I think the sacred duty of every president is to put his or her citizens first. They don't agree. So we can have these ideological degrees, and I think that's fine with the way that they drafted this. But again, I'll get to other reasons why I think it's inappropriate to even have the letter in the first place. But we're going down here and we see the moral foundations now in grave danger. The challenge comes from within. So now they're basically using the words that they criticized President Trump for using, the threat from within. And President Trump used that on his campaign trail. We're talking about dishonest government employees, corrupt federal workers, people within inside the government. And now they're saying that. You'll see a lot of what we call classical projection in psychology in this letter. And then we're going to see a lot of cognitive dissonance or hypocrisy, right? So President Trump and his administration have assaulted the pillars of our democracy here at home and our strength around the world. So another word that they use a lot is democracy. Now that's interesting because for many of us that are conservatives, we believe we have a constitutional republic based on democratic principles where people get votes. But in a constitutional republic, we elect our representatives who then go ahead. We give them the ability to speak for us. In a real democracy, everybody gets a vote and that vote has equal weight. So we have kind of democratic votes in that people do get votes, but we're voting for representatives who then turn represent us. And sometimes they may vote for something we don't want them to. And we have to live with that because in a republic, that's how you do it. So they just forget to give everybody the civics lesson on that. And they just go right to our democracy is in danger. Well, their idea of what a democracy is much different from many people in the country, especially those who voted for President Trump. So now we go to internationally. So Trump has questioned the value of long-standing alliances in Europe and Asia. So what? It's good for a president to question whether these alliances are fair and if they can be improved. I was very proud of President Trump when he addressed NATO and said, "You guys have to pay more. We are providing you our blood and treasure at a higher percentage of GDP than anyone, and you're not." Canada has been the biggest freeloader in that sense. They have a very small percentage. I think it's a 1.3 or less of their GDP that they contribute, and they just basically expect the United States would protect them if they ever if anyone invaded North America. They just do. So they don't really make it a priority. So you have Canada in that aspect. You have the other NATO members who were not pulling their share. And President Trump comes up and says, "Hey, we want to have good friendships with you, but you guys got to make them fair and equal." And a lot of Americans voted for that. So they don't see that apparently as something you can do if you're the US president. You can't question existing relationships. You just have to leave them as they are. And they were not mutually beneficial relationships. So it's okay for our president to go ahead and see if these relationships can be made more fair. I think most Americans don't have any problem with that.
It's very interesting how emotional terminology is, right? You just referred to Canada, and here the sentence says, poison ties with our closest neighbors. So the negotiations and the desire to come to a better agreement here is being referred to as poisonous.
Yeah. Again, these are all loaded terms. And look, here's the reality is my colleagues who signed this letter, they might believe this. Maybe they do believe it. And I'm going to get to that issue at the end of our show tonight, is that that's the sad thing, is that people who really can get along and work together, now we're so differently divided in our ideas, our ideologies, and our political beliefs, and the direction of our country, that we really feel so passionately in two completely polarized directions. And I think that's the sad part. So now we go to our borders. He's talking about, after he talks about questioning the value of longstanding alliances in Europe and Asia. Well, look, we're getting people to the table to renegotiate those alliances and making sure that they're more fair. And I think for the long time in the United States, we really bought into, and that's not just the Democrat administrations, it's Republicans as well, bought into purchasing favors and loyalty and alliances through what we call soft power, through foreign aid and assistance and just outright cash, from taxpayer money to countries, so that we could have them support us in what we wanted them to support us in, and behave the way we thought they should be behaving. That's kind of been turned on its head with this administration. I understand that's radical for people, but we will never get out of that system. We're basically the welfare state for many other countries, and providing them welfare assistance. It's just not sustainable anymore. It hasn't been sustainable for decades, but we've been doing it anyway. And I think a lot of diplomats have bought into that, that was one of the great tools in the toolkit, is just foreign assistance for everybody. And that will really help us. And you can't go back and renegotiate deals. We have to just keep giving more and more assistance to keep those relationships strong. It's ridiculous. That's not we. And the other countries just played along because it was advantageous for them. I don't blame them at all. I think we've done some really bad negotiating in our alliances, and we can do better. Doesn't mean we won't be there to protect our friends and allies, but it means that the relationships will actually be more equal. And that's what we're looking for, people who voted for President Trump. Of course, my colleagues did not vote for him. Maybe some of them did. I doubt it. And we'll talk about why that's a factor in a second. So we've talked about our closest neighbors. So Mexico. So really, to even say something like that, on our borders, he has poison ties with our closest neighbors. Do they mean closest in terms of geography? I think so. I don't think they're the closest in terms of other things we're working on. I think some other countries are closer aligned to our values than Mexico and Canada. So I think we're talking about geographic, right? He has undermined the bedrock principles of world peace, that sovereign borders will be respected. Has he, though? Let's talk about that. The United States now seeks to lay claim to Greenland. the Panama Canal and Canada, greenlighting other countries to proceed as they see fit, most notably Russia and Ukraine. That right there is, my friend, is classic psychological projection. The last sentence there about greenlighting Russia. You know who greenlighted Russia? President Obama in 2014 and President Biden in 2021. That's who greenlighted Russia to go into Ukraine both times through weakness. So that's just something that conservatives can easily refute. Now, when they're talking about the Panama Canal, I think it is having President Trump as a businessman and not a politician who's not used to doing things like a typical politician does. My colleagues seem to still have a problem with that. They don't like that he uses language like that, making jokes about Canada being the 51st state. And then they say, well, he wasn't really joking, so this is terrible. Well, again, establishing a position that we've been bankrolling Canada's economy in many respects for years, providing them free support, and then they boo us at sports events when our national anthem is played. And then my colleagues will say they're only booing Trump. They're not booing Americans. It's ridiculous. So President Trump comes along and he tries to make things fair, and then he's the bad guy. Could he use different language? 100%. We've talked about that on this program, that sometimes the delivery from President Trump makes it very, easy for people who don't like him to like him even less. He's not going to change. He's 78, almost 79, I think, and he's not going to change his style, his delivery, how he is brash. But let's look at his actions, though. He was the only president so far that we had that didn't have a war under his administration. He has been very vocal about not having any wars and trying to end as many as he can. But that's all gets dismissed because they run with a clip or a sentence or a phrase or a word that he says that they can run with, and with the Trump derangement syndrome, and just keep making the villain out of him. Look, something had to change with Canada and Mexico. The fentanyl issue, President Trump was really touched by the parents and families of those who have been killed because of all of the illegal fentanyl that was in. And when we talk about our closest neighbor, Mexico, President Trump's language is a little brash, but it gets Mexico to start sewing up that border and stop all the sex trafficking. These are minor children being sex trafficked through our country. It's disgusting that people wouldn't even make that the number one issue. So they don't really have much of a leg to stand on when they start comparing these things if they're being intellectually honest. Of course, they're not. This is 100% politically driven, and that's why they're doing this. So if we keep going here, senseless tariffs. That's another one here. So we've got undermined by Trump's senseless tariffs. Now, I worked at the U.S. Trade Representative's office. I know a lot about trade and tariffs. Know how they're generally used and how they're generally not used. And yes, I'll concede the point that the way President Trump views tariffs and he uses them is clearly out of the box through standard operations. Most people would not consider using tariffs the way that he is. But they're not senseless. They're different. You have to give President Trump the benefit of the doubt that he's using tariffs to try to equalize our unfair trade relationships in terms of barriers as well as trade deficits. So he's making an effort. Are all of his attempts to make those trade relationships more equal going to work? Probably not. Is it something that he ran on to make our relationships with countries more equal? 100%. So the fact that he's actually doing it is what my colleagues have a real problem with.
Dr. Slowinski, I have a question for you
Yeah.
here. So in terms of people writing this letter, right, in terms of the other side,
I have no idea who wrote it.
viewpoints, I'm curious, what would be the alternative to the trade deficit and the U.S. national debt, right? I see a lot
Just
of
keep
criticism.
climbing. Just keep
That's-
climbing. That's what
Is
what
it
the
that simple? Just going with it until what?
Well, some of my progressive friends have embraced the modern monetary theory that almost we can just keep printing money with no repercussions because we're the biggest economy still. That could change. And then we wouldn't be, and we couldn't be just keep printing money. We'd lose the value in our money to an extent that we'd end up in a bad situation, sort of like Argentina. So we couldn't do that. Um, so that was the other option for them, is just to keep doing things the way we've been doing them. And that's not going to work. And I think that's a good segue here. We get into the senseless tariffs. And then we get the dismantling of USAID. I think what they didn't talk about is all of the fraud, waste, and abuse that the federal government writ large, not just USAID, but every agency has really not taken that serious over the years. We just haven't. We'll have close to $40 trillion in debt soon. I think we're at 38 now. It's going to get there pretty quickly. Um, Probably by the time I have a next grandchild, we'll hit 40 trillion, if not sooner. And this is just sad. Yes, I understand that federal employees are people too. They have livelihoods, and if their jobs are being cut, it's not an easy thing to do ever, to cut jobs or to downsize or to make any kind of cuts. But taxpayers want those cuts. And this is kind of the cognitive dissonance, right? You have a group of highly paid, they were paid highly. If you reach the rank of ambassador or a high level senior person in the State Department or any of the federal agencies, you're making pretty good money. You also get tons of benefits. You get advantageous pensions that most people in the private sector would never get, right? Tons of all sorts of other benefits that they're allowed to get, that average people don't get. And I see these signs in Northern Virginia, support our federal employees. Fine. Where were the signs during COVID or other times when so many Americans lost their jobs? Were there signs in people's front yards? Help our small business neighbors, help our small businesses. We support our small businesses. Zero signs, because everybody wanted everything closed down because the government said we had to close down. So it's this cognitive dissonance, right? Um, We'll see what happens with downsizing the government, but this is a classic conservative versus liberal debate that's gone on for a long time. Bigger government versus smaller government. And because most Americans do have that shared value of being kind and not wanting to see anybody lose their job, myself included, we've been able to kick that can down the road and not reduce our staffing in the federal government. So that's something that Doge and the president have tried to do. We'll see what actually happens from that. But I think most Americans are still happy that they're giving it a shot. They're trying to better use the taxpayer money. So we've got these senseless tariffs. We've got dismantling of USAID. We've got domestically now. So now we've got Trump aggressively eliminating constraints on his power and fomenting fear. All right. So this paragraph in particular, I'm going to read it through, and then let's just ask if conservatives would say everything that they listed is what happened to conservatives and to the American people under the Biden administration in the last 4 years. So here's the first one. Aggressively eliminating constraints on his power and fomenting fear. Look at all the people that were arrested, the lawfare that happened under President Biden, censorship, people lost their jobs, canceled, people were canceled. They couldn't access social media. Social media was told to keep conservatives off or demonetize them. He's intimidating independent media outlets with frivolous lawsuits. Are they frivolous for whom? President Trump was tortured for years. Every single lawsuit they could bring about this man, they did. So I think he has a right to challenge those lawsuits against him and the actions that were taken against him. They may not go anywhere, but he has a right to do that. And if they're talking about his personal lawsuits or lawsuits from the government, which may be a different issue, either way, the president has the right to do that. President Biden was clearly supportive of a lot of lawsuits against people he didn't particularly like. That's just a fact. Our universities, here's interesting. Our universities are retreating from freedom of speech because of explicit threats to withdraw federal monies. That one, the hypocrisy in that one is just so rich for me. Our universities are retreating from freedom of speech. When's the last time that the universities you saw on TV, especially the Ivy League schools and others, were bastions of freedom of speech? They banned and censored any conservative thought that they could, any opposing thought. And they just simply labeled it hate speech or threatening speech. Um, so that's the way they took care of that. So now they're saying the shoe is on the other foot, apparently. So now that protesters can't go out and say free, free Palestine, then somehow their freedom of speech is in trouble. Okay. Um, and the reason they can't say that is that it's not that's not the only thing they're saying, Victor. They're saying a whole bunch of the anti-Semitic tropes that have been around for a long time, and professors and university administrators at some universities just turn a blind eye to it because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to um, get on the bad side of students that are very liberal like they are. Um, so that's the university issue. Now let's go to the next one that's really rich. Our law firms are being bludgeoned into denying representation to anyone whom this administration does not like. What happened to all the attorneys that were hired to help and support the Trump administration? They couldn't get a job. They were sued, they were threatened, they were charged. And so now we have this. Our law firms are being bludgeoned. Are you kidding me? What happened to all the conservative lawyers and law firms that were being bludgeoned under the Biden administration? Okay, so now we go to the next one. Our medical research centers are seeing an exodus, right, of experts forced out by an administration that does not believe in basic science. Really? Basic science? What are we talking about? The scientific method? Making sure that you actually, when you create a vaccine, that it actually works and doesn't have tremendous side effects. What do they mean? Are we talking about climate change, which there are different data sets on that? That is not conclusive evidence. And that's the problem is that um, people look even at data much differently. We call it p hacking in research, right? Where you have a p value that tells you something significant. So my point in raising this is I can read one study and I can have a p value that shows me this phenomenon that I looked at, my team looked at, was very significant. And then I find another group of researchers and scientists who find the complete opposite data and findings for the same phenomenon looked at almost the same way. Because people cannot leave their biases alone, even in scientific research. So that one, I'm not buying it. I think that actually we have a Health and Human Services secretary who cares about the health of every citizen, especially children, what we consume, access to medical treatment. President Trump is still a president, not Robert F. Kennedy Jr., even if you don't like him as much, but you love President Trump. President Trump really surprised me with his right to try. Do you know anything about right to try, Victor?
If you'd like to give a refresher to those who
Yeah,
don't.
right to try was this amazing thing where President Trump said, look, I came into the office and I heard all these stories of people who were terminally ill. They were probably going to die, but government regulation would not allow them to try these experimental drugs, even though they had a diagnosis of a terminal illness. And President Trump said, no, it's going to be right to try. You're going to get to, if you're considered terminally ill, you're going to get to try. And if that means that this particular drug hasn't gone through all of the extensive testing. This is for terminally ill people. How is that a bad thing for people to try to give them something that might actually work for them? Right. So they've created again this idea President Trump is evil, he's bad, and anybody who follows him or believes in his policies, ergo, is also bad. And that's what I really have a hard time with is these sweeping generalizations that are in this article. And a lot of them are just not factual. On the surface, there may be some truth in them in the way they look at the world, But if they were to dig a little bit deeper, they would see first the cognitive dissonance in their arguments and how hypocritical they were and how projecting they were. And then second, they would see that there are other ways to look at that situation than the way they are.
I think it's very ironic too that they utilize the word believe next to the science, right? Because it shows a little bit of the cultish vibe here. If we think back to COVID days, right, where we were forced to believe versus to actually look at the facts, right, as we later found out, the very nature of science is questioning. And the idea that you need to believe in certain scientific facts is a little bit ridiculous, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, 100%. Let's go down still past this part here. Congress and the Department of Justice threaten to impeach sitting judges that rule against the government. When's the last time you didn't hear a Democrat threatening to impeach somebody? I mean, are they going to say that Democrats have never threatened to impeach someone other than the president? That's not true. Um, the way it works is you can impeach any federal official, can go through an impeachment process too. But guess what? You have to have the numbers in the Senate, and the House first has to bring the impeachment into play, and then second of all, you've got to have the numbers, two-thirds votes in the Senate to make that a reality. Um, it's not really a. I think more when people talk about impeaching, the way that our Senate and our House are so close together, and there's not huge majorities, it's really not possible. You can put someone through the process. This is why the Democrats impeached President Trump twice because it's expensive. It drags the candidate down. It drags the president down. It stymies their progress. It's a very tactical way to cause problems for a sitting president. It's also a way to cause problems for federal employees. But the idea that judges are immune from any kind of responsibility for the lawfare that's going on. I mean, impeachment is just one tool. It's really a final tool. But it's again the cognitive dissonance. A week ago, you and I could find clips of Democrats calling for all sorts of different federal people to be impeached. I'm sure some judges would be there. I know that they've asked for Clarence Thomas to be impeached, and he's a Supreme Court justice. And I know there are people in Congress that actually were requesting that he be impeached. So again, the cognitive dissonance or the hypocrisy, it's just all over the place. What else do we have here? Federal trade unions have been shut down by executive order. Well, that's a complicated thing with federal trade unions. In the interest of time, we're going to go on here to state governments that challenge the administration face cuts in federal funding. It's state governments that challenge executive orders or challenge existing law. I mean, look at state, what do they call them? The cities and the sanctuary states and sanctuary cities. That's against the law, but they do it anyway because it's their state law or their city law. They don't really care about federal law. They constantly do that. And, basically, if the courts step in, and the thing about the courts that's really hard for conservatives is that for the longest time, first in federal employees that are here in what we call the DMV, District, Maryland, and Virginia, overwhelming majority are liberal or Democrat. And how do you know that? You know that by we're able to get data on the donations to presidential campaigns and party campaigns, and it's always in the high 90s for the Democrats. It's always less than 5 to 10% for Republicans or conservatives. That's just a fact. So they make up a huge power block. And these former diplomats, a lot of them have stayed in the area. This is where, we have to live. I'm in Northern Virginia right now. You have to live here, but it's a highly liberal center, the whole Maryland, Virginia, DC. So that geography really plays a role. And what I'm trying to connect that to is judges. You can get judges from very blue states very easily to weigh in because they feel very passionate that they have a role to stop President Trump. So let's not talk about again the hypocrisy here. So federal funding, look, If a state is not upholding the law or even executive order, they can challenge that. And if they're lucky enough to get, activist judges that are going to be on their side, then maybe they get it overturned. But they have to go through the process. So that's how that works. We'll see. But I think a lot of us are really saddened by how Article 3, which sets aside the judiciary in our Constitution, how it is so one-sided in many ways. That's another reason why people who have very liberal ideas, or even if they're not liberal, but they can't stand President Trump, they feel very empowered to write a letter like this. Because for the longest time, their courts, their judges, their states where they live in, everyone they know, their neighbors, they're all liberal. They're all similar minded. And they live in these echo chambers where they can write these things and they don't think that there's anyone else that would disagree with them, really. I thought that President Trump's second election would have changed their minds about that. And they might have just taken a step back and said, they voted for him again, despite everything we threw at him, everything we accused him of. The media was in our pockets. They helped us not 24/7 to put out terrible hit pieces on the president all the time, and he still won. I thought they might take a step backwards because I got to tell you, many of these colleagues I know that signed this letter are some of the smartest, impressive people that I know. And for them not to take an intellectual step backwards and say, well, why did so many Americans really vote for President Trump? What is it that is unfair or needs to be changed that he tapped into instead of Trump bad, everyone liberal good? And I think that dichotomy is just really sad. So then we go back down here to the one sentence here that I think just, if they had left this out, it would have been much better, I think, for their arguments. So we've got this here, a racist, misogynistic, and homophobic mindset is leading to the erasure of history and national heroes at our cultural institutions. So they had to stick that in there, right? So they don't call President Trump those names directly, but it's intimated or implied, right? That's what this is all about, President Trump, and he's spearheading all of this hate. Really, I think that's just so unfair and just so intellectually bankrupt to just assume that people that are supporting President Trump really have issues with people that are different colors or people that are, maybe gay, whatever it is. It's just ridiculous that they really don't know conservatives that well. We try to, at least me, I can't speak for every conservative by any means, but for me, I try to live my life based on Christian values and treating everybody with respect and equally and trying to help everybody that I can. That's not the case here. One of the things I noticed when I made my support for being a conservative more public was I had people just started, you know, what is it called? Not blocking me, but unfriending me, or even sending me a text and say, if you voted for that man, there's no way we can be friends. And I thought, are we little children?
Isn't
I
that
mean, I have
crazy?
grandchildren, and you're going to write to me and tell me we can't be friends because I voted for Hitler? It's just insane. In a country with a proud history of immigration, legal residents are being illegally deported for expressing an opinion. So
That's a big one.
this is an interesting thing because I don't know if my colleagues have really, that wrote this letter, really dug into this legal versus illegal. There is often sometimes in the immigration processes where you can have an order of deportation. You can have standing orders ready to go, but there's some time in between. And during that time that's in between, they're not necessarily legal or illegal. They're kind of in this holding pattern. But they certainly don't just to get rid of that deportation order, or they don't have to face the consequences of illegal acts. And so I think that's also our colleagues playing with words there. And for most Americans, if you came into this country illegally, right, you were not supposed to be here. You claimed asylum illegally because you're really an economic migrant and you lied about it and you made up a story that your lawyers told you to tell. We have a problem with that. A lot of people have a problem with that. You know who have a really big problem with it? immigrants like yourself who did everything the right way. And then you have
Absolutely.
people coming in who lied. Maybe they have, I'm not doubting that they have terrible lives, but the processes are there for a reason. They're to protect our homeland and our country. And mass illegal immigration or unvetted, unchecked immigration is a big, big threat to national security because it affects our economics. It affects the resources we have. Well, we are a generous people. We even allow people who are here illegally, their children, to go to school and pay for it. They get a medical treatment. We don't turn them away. They actually get tons of benefits at the city, state, and federal level. So those are the things that people want changed. And it is not that Americans are anti-immigration, they're anti-illegal immigration. But it didn't surprise me that this letter did not make that distinction. They never do. They always talk about migration or immigration, and they don't really talk about legal versus illegal immigration. And that's what most conservatives are upset about, including President Trump, not legal immigration. Now, can you make an argument for more legal immigration? Sure. I think a lot of conservatives would like to have that discussion on legal immigration, just not illegal immigration. And then you've got coming down here a couple more before they give us a whole list of things, this call to action that everybody has to do. So here we have American democracy and American security are inextricably linked. I agree with that. But again, the word democracy, maybe you could say liberty, freedom. Um, what do they mean by democracy? Ability to vote, ability to choose. What do they mean? It's a word that they like to use, but it has different meaning now for different people, especially people who really respect a constitutional republic and don't want anarchy, which real democracy kind of is. Right? Weaken one and the other inevitably being in default. Well, okay, you can make that maybe just take American freedom and liberty and replace that or leave democracy in if you want. But I don't think most people have a problem with that. As patriots and public servants, from both parties who worked to protect America over many decades, we see that link unraveling at lightning speed. Really? Because a lot of us don't. We don't see that. We do not see American democracy and American security breaking. In fact, what we see is illegal immigration at the border down 99%. Um, that is something that Americans overwhelmingly wanted President Trump to fix. So that's not true. Many of us have served in countries where democratically elected leaders followed a path to autocracy, and we know this crisis requires an urgent and unified response. So they're calling Trump an autocrat. But we can see that the judiciary, the Supreme Court, district judges are doing, their jobs, and they're making decisions that check that role. I think that many of them are unfair if you assume that the district judges and the federal judges are not being partisan, then maybe that's different, but a lot of them are. And so overall, okay, that paragraph's not too bad. And here they do this call for action, right? So now they want to get everybody out in the streets and doing stuff, right? So they want former senior officials, including presidents, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, and chiefs of staff of our military services, must jointly and publicly challenge the administration's dangerous policies and dismantling of essential institutions. Oh, yeah, they can do that. In fact, they do it a lot. Former presidents, secretaries of state, secretaries of defense, there was so many of them that criticized President Trump in his first term. And now in the second, some as well. I don't see why you have to have more of that. Certain media stations let them come on and they cover their interviews and they are always good about giving it to President Trump. So I don't think that's something they have to do more of necessarily. Business leaders must condemn Trump's disastrous trade policy, which is plunging the global economy into chaos and disrupting supply chains that support millions of jobs. Have we seen that yet? Has that really come into play? I will say this. I mean, right now, there's fear for that. I worked in economics and trade. You certainly don't want a situation where you have this global panic and the supply shipment issues and all those things that go with it. I do hope that we are going to get better deals and these are more negotiating and we can move those tariffs off fairly quickly. I know from my time at being a trade negotiator, the president's empowered to take these tariffs off pretty quickly. He's got advisors around him all the time, and he's pretty savvy on indicators that make him nervous. No one expects him to plunge us to let this continue, and he would remove some of these tariffs, I think, if he needed to. We've already seen that a little bit in the negotiations, even with China. The EU is tricky, so we'll see how that goes with them. But we have other deals going on, and hopefully Canada and Mexico will continue to make a better USMC, US Mexico Canada trade deal that's more advantageous to the United States. Because, look, we've kind of been the benefactor. We've been in that position where a lot of us are grateful for all of the benefits and blessings that we have to be Americans, and we try to be generous and helpful. But at the same time, other people have taken advantage of that fact. And I think that's what they see in President Trump is not an evil autocrat man or dictator, but somebody who's looking at his country and trying to protect his own citizens. So that's the difference that my colleagues and I have on this situation and how they write it up. So we've got the medical institutions here on research. Okay, I'm not under the impression that we're going to stop doing medical research. We're probably going to do ones that are more ethical to do, and then also spend our money on research more wisely and not on research that doesn't make a lot of sense. So it's easy to hear that we're going to close down all this research when that isn't really the case. Again, this is all a lot of spin. If it were to be the case and we found out that really critical research had been stopped for no good reason, I think that would be something I would get behind. I haven't seen evidence of that. I've seen delays in funding. I've seen the funding that I've seen that's been under scrutiny is because they want to make sure that the type of research we're funding makes sense and is actually helping Americans. And I think that's fair. Universities and media must protect free speech. That's rich. Is that irony or what? I mean, if you're a conservative, you're like, well, duh. Where were you when we were getting, demonetized off of YouTube and kicked off of social media and our president was kicked off of Twitter? I mean, where were you about the free speech? Right? So it's just disingenuous and it's bankrupt of any integrity to make a statement like that when and not and just pretend that what happened the last few years didn't happen. Our largest law firms must remain guardians of rule of law by resisting administration pressure to undermine the legal system of checks and balances, which is so fundamental to our democracy. I don't know any I don't know that anyone could compare honestly the amount of lawyers and money that the Democrats and liberals have compared to conservatives in terms of lawsuits. I think they're doing a good job of lawyering up and trying to stop President Trump's agenda with any lawsuit that they can. I don't see that stopping anytime soon. Because what happens is you have these wealthy donors that back these law firms and then they're able to provide sue pro bono in these court cases for free because they're getting backed by these big liberal donors. So that's already happening. I guess they just want it to happen more. Finally, politicians on both sides of the aisle who believe in the core values of our Constitution must actively oppose the administration's efforts undermining our national security, our freedom, and our democracy. Waiting passively for electoral calendar to fight back does nothing more than give the administration additional time and running room to impose its authoritarian stamp ever more securely on government and on all of us. Okay. Um, so here we go. No American should be silent. No American who cares about our freedoms, our institutions, and our identity. Okay, so why don't you just write your congressman? Why don't you write your congressman, go through the accepted channel for when you have a grievance? Write your congressman, call your senator. No, they want us not to be a bystander. They're using language here that I find a little bit threatening. Each of us in different ways speak out, mobilize, defend our way of life. That's dangerous language. Are people gonna believe, just because there's a letter by 200 former diplomats and intelligence folks and national security folks just run out and do this? No, they don't really have that much credibility with at least half the country. I don't even know if many Americans really know what diplomats do, to tell you the truth. If they don't live in DC, they may not have thought about that. They have other important things in their lives that have nothing to do with the worlds that we live in the district in Maryland and Virginia. So that's one thing. The moment requires nothing less. We must recognize the seriousness of what is taking place and act collectively to restore our democracy and our security. Well, we kind of did that from 2020 to 24. We mobilized in terms of conservatives. We got the vote out and we got what we wanted. And they have every right to say that. I just think these letters coming from former officials are so 2020. So I don't think they're very effective. But what I wanted to close with is the sadness that I feel about this, because like I said, a lot of these people, or not a lot, but a chunk of these people that signed this letter, I worked for them or I worked with them. I was in meetings with them and we laughed and we accomplished all these things together. And now I'm sad that we don't see things very clearly at all. Now, I don't know what their motivation was for signing, if they believed every word of the letter. But I take umbrage with kind of this call to action. I think they could have done a great job by saying, don't do anything silly. Don't go out in the streets and cause violence and burn things down and attack people. They didn't say any of that. I was thinking about this letter and about Maxine Waters. Do you know Representative Waters from California? She was very famous for, well, she's famous for a lot of things, usually ridiculously crazy comments. And one of the things that she said was, it was during the first Trump administration. If you see a Trump official out there, you make a crowd, and I don't know the exact words that she said, and you push back on them, and you tell them they're not wanted, I think is what she said. Um, this is why I wish they would have clarified that a little bit more with peaceful. Every American has a right to read this letter. All of my colleagues that signed this letter have that right. Um, I don't think you're going to see conservatives ever do one of these letters because, as my kids say, it's pretty cringe. And then, second of all, it's just the sense of entitlement you think you have that you're influential. Thank you for your service. Move on. Really. The American people have voted for a new way. It may work out, it may not work out. We might have a Democrat administration in 2028. I don't know. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a seer. I have no idea. But I do respect the process. And it doesn't sound like they're respecting the process. This is almost still not election denial, but it's more interference, right? We didn't like the outcome, so now we're going to complain about it. So I wish my colleagues would have taken a different approach. They had that right. That's what's beautiful about America, but it is kind of sad. Um, I don't know any conservatives during the Biden time when things were so bad and we were sitting there just pulling our hair out. And many of us felt embarrassed during that time as well. Um, but we didn't go get together and make a letter. And I'll just close with this. One of the reasons that we aren't able to do that in some respects, I don't know if we would first, but second, I would recommend against these cringe letters. But if we wanted to, conservatives would have to really think about repercussions for this. I think my colleagues see that there's no repercussions for them, using this kind of language. Um, it's not going to really hurt them getting another position or another seat on a board. It's not. So they don't really lose a lot by signing this letter. If a conservative were to write a letter like that during the Biden administration, everything would be done to cancel that person's career. Even if they retired, they would try to affect their livelihood after retirement. So with that, I wanted to just get that off my chest, take take a little time and dissect a letter. What's really cool is the YouTube channels that have the lawyers on it, and they go line by line of lawsuits and court cases and findings and rulings by different cases. And it's kind of what we did tonight, trying to get our liberal friends here And maybe someone will deny that they're liberal. Well, our friends that wrote this letter, maybe get them to think a little bit more about that. Their words do matter. Their language was offensive to many people, and it was inappropriate. So with that, turn it over to you, Victor, for closing thoughts of someone who didn't work with these people but read the letter, and just tell me what you think.
Very insightful, first of all. Thank you so much, Dr. Slowinski. It was a great dissection. And I think it's very important to talk about things like that, right? And the motivation behind that, and especially that call for action, words about mobilizing, especially as we observe situations where people's vehicles get burned, right, and destroyed just for the simple fact that the manager of the company has certain political beliefs is very non-American. And the idea that if you read in between the lines, this is essentially what this letter is asking for, right? Don't wait for the elections. Don't pay attention to a calendar.
Yeah, it's not clear, right? It could be read either way, and I think where they should have done is given examples of what's appropriate behavior, but they haven't.
And probably there is a reason behind that.
Yeah.
So very great experience. And to our subscribers, this wasn't our typical podcast. If you want like more formats of that nature, I'm sure Dr. Slowinski and I would love to accommodate, perhaps have Q&A sessions and really get into foreign affairs and diplomacy, because it often gets ignored, especially in the public arena as people observe domestic news and things that happen around the world. But diplomats are the ones who are making those news and the headlines behind the scenes, right? So understanding that kitchen is very important, I think.
I think in Europe, I think, like I said, most Americans really don't under that structure. Part of it is because we call them foreign service officers, and if you haven't traveled a lot and had to use an embassy or consulate, you don't really understand the whole thing about a diplomat. But um, I think with most federal employees, there's a great rule of thumb is be grateful that you had that opportunity. Um, and then when you're done, you should be done. Get out of the way. Don't come back and get a second scoop. Don't do that. It's bad. It's in bad form. It's in bad taste. And if you're going to do it for something constructive, not to attack a sitting president and his voters. And it's just not appropriate. But again, I support their right to, co-sign anything they want. That's what's beautiful about America. I mean, trying to think about how many countries where a letter like this would get those people in trouble. They're not going to get in any trouble. It's their right to say, this is how we view the situation. And it's my right to refute that and say, that's not how I see it at all.
That's right. But at the same time, it's a little bit concerning that there is a huge substance of people that just perceives the opposing political view as being non-American, right? Because essentially what I can see in this letter is, if you don't have our opinion, we don't really consider your interests, right? And it could have been a little bit more accommodating to other political
Yeah,
views.
no. And I think I tried to explain it, and I don't think I did it in a great way. A lot of these former employees live in an area where everyone has this kind of groupthink. They kind of vote the same, they think the same. Their school teachers think the same, their school boards, their cities, their mayors, and it just kind of seeps in over time. And I think they were just, looking at the world through that lens and not seeing that there's a huge swath of the country that voted for President Trump and, wants to give him a chance to try something different. And like I said, I'll be the first one that will speak up if some of these decisions are really terrible for our country. I don't see it right now. If I did see it as a big thing, I would speak up against it, and I think many people would. Um, but that's not what I'm seeing now. I'm still willing to give him and his team the chance to try something new and different, because we can't keep going down this road in terms of debt, in terms of losing our status and our power and our ability to keep people out of war. One of the things that this letter kind of touches on is this, that we've lost our strength. Does that mean because we aren't ready just to go start a new war? I'm happy with that. I'm happy if heaven forbid you have to get deployed. I would never want to see a day like that, where any American has to go to a war that they didn't start. Um, So I think we have the whole neocon issue, the libcon issue, where uh, there are a group of people that don't mind the United States getting involved in wars or overthrowing governments or forcing our way of life on other people. This president isn't that way, and I think that's really hard for them. It probably hits the bottom lines of people too. His policies might affect contracts, might affect opportunities. There may be a personal avenue in here that's kind of affecting them as well. I get it, but you know what? They're grown adults. They can find something else to do.
Indeed.
So,
Well, we're all about challenging ideas here on Top of Mind. And Dr. Slowinski, thank you for another excellent episode. I know we have a few really promising guests coming up. So to our followers and dear subscribers, please stay tuned. We're going to continue improving the format and the way we communicate. We need a little bit of support. So your share and like is the minimum you can do to help us on this journey.
yeah, thank you, Victor, and thanks to everybody who sat through that lecture. So,
Thank you so much.
all right, take care.
Bye.
In a world full of noise, clarity is power. Stay informed, stay aware, stay top of mind.